We begin my top 36 remaining wide receiver rankings with wide receivers that I think are mid to low end wide receiver threes. We have Keon Coleman, Keenan Allen, Jalen Tolbert, and Jacoby Myers. Keon Coleman is facing the Jets this week. It's a poor matchup, obviously. He does expect to see some Sauce Gardner, although I think with Khalil Shakir likely missing this game, that he sees an extra bit of the target share. And I think that they'll also try to move him around the formation a little bit to try to avoid that matchup. And so I do think that out of all the wide receivers, I like him the most, at least in terms of Bills wide receivers. Keenan Allen plays the Jaguars. It's definitely an advantageous matchup. I like all of the Bears wide receivers a lot more this week. And so I think that all three are reasonably good starts. I think that Caleb Williams is really going to show out in easy matchups. I'd probably avoid him in the Bears offense as much as you reasonably can in poor matchups. And so I do think that Keenan Allen is a good floor play this week. It's just without a touchdown, the ceiling probably isn't that high. Jalen Tolbert is playing the Lions this week. It's a great matchup. I think with Brandon Cooks still being out, that Jalen Tolbert's a good bet to see an extra little bit of the target share. I don't project him scoring a touchdown, but if he does, he's going to score much higher than this. And I think that Dallas in general is going to have to pass the ball quite a bit to stay in this game. Jacoby Myers is going to be without Devontae Adams, and so I do think that while that does increase his target share, I don't like the matchup against Pittsburgh. He's also going to have Aiden O'Connell instead of Gardner Minshew. And so I do like that a little bit less for him than I would with Gardner Minshew. Gardner Minshew is a little bit more fearless. And so while that isn't better for turnovers, that's better for the assets in the passing game. And so I do think they're going to be a little bit more conservative this week. And so I do think he's a reasonably low floor, low ceiling option, but he should get a little bit more of the target share this week. Now we have wide receivers that I think are probably mid to high end wide receiver threes. We have Michael Pittman, Christian Kirk, Amari Cooper, Wan'Dale Robinson, George Pickens, Xavier Legette, and Rome Odunze. Michael Pittman's coming off 2 games in which, in terms of fantasy at least, he's performed better than the first 3 weeks. Last week, it was more so just that he happened to get a touchdown, and the week before, he had a good game overall. It's a terrible matchup against the Titans this week, and it's a little bit peculiar with him because as of 2-3 days ago, he was supposed to head to IR, and then magically he has a full practice and is good to go this week. And so I don't like him quite as much as I would because it seems as though he's going to try to tough it out with a back injury and in what is just about the worst matchup imaginable. And so if you can avoid him, I probably would, but just given the potential volatility in what is a bad matchup combined with him playing through injury. But if you drafted him in redraft, you're probably having to play him unless you have a good bench option that is a better matchup this week. And yeah, I would try to avoid him if you can, but you probably drafted him at the point in which you're going to have to play him. Christian Kirk is playing Chicago. It's a terrible matchup. I do suspect that the Jaguars are going to have to throw a lot to stay in this game. I think the Bears' offense is going to have a lot of success. And so I do think that Christian Kirk, BTJ, and Evan Ingram are going to get a lot of volume this week. And so I don't think he scores a touchdown, but I think he gets a good amount of volume. Amari Cooper is playing Philly this week. While he hasn't performed that great the past couple of weeks, he did have an 80-plus yard touchdown called back about 2 weeks ago. And so I do think they're going to have to pass the ball quite a bit to stay in this game. I just don't think they're going to be able to stay in this game with Deshaun Watson's struggles. Wan'Dale Robinson is playing Cincinnati this week. He does get another week without Malik Neighbors, so I like that for his target share. I just think he's going to be a high volume, low yardage, no touchdown output for us this week. And so I think it's a very, very safe floor, but just a little bit of a limited ceiling. George Pickens plays Las Vegas this week. I don't like the matchup for him so much as I do Justin Fields. I think Justin Fields has a lot of success running the ball this week. Pickens has been a little bit hit or miss. He's gotten a decent amount of volume from week to week, with the exception of that one 4-target game. I just think that Max Crosby is going to be a little bit too ferocious for this offensive line. And so I don't think that Justin Fields is going to have that much time to pass. Thus, I think they're going to have a lot more success running the ball. I like Fields and Najee a little bit more than I like the pass catchers this week. Xavier Legette is playing the Falcons this week. I think that this is a high-scoring game between the Panthers and the Falcons, and I like basically all fantasy assets on both sides of the ball. With Legette, 2 weeks ago he had a great fantasy game. He did suffer an injury, and so last week wasn't that good. He's going to play this week, though. And so I do think he gets a good amount of volume, and I think he's a really safe floor play. And if he happens to get a touchdown, which I don't project for him this week, I think he has a pretty good game. Next up, we have Rome Odunze against Jacksonville. I like all of the passing assets in the Bears offense, with the exception of Cole Kmet this week. I think his week is going to be a little bit stunted by the volume that goes to the receivers. And we've seen throughout the season that he's been barely missed either with an inaccurate pass or just Caleb Williams hasn't seen him beating guys deep. And so all we need to do is start to see that connection grow because he is burning defenders downfield. In this one, I think he sees a good amount of volume, and I do think he gets a good chunk gain or two. Wide receivers that I think are probably mid to low-end wide receiver twos are Josh Downs, Darnell Mooney, Jamison Williams, Rashid Shaheed, Deontay Johnson, Dontavian Wicks, Devontae Smith, Chris Olave, Tank Dell, and T. Higgins. Josh Downs, I think, sees a little bit extra work. He had a full practice. With Michael Pittman nursing injury, I suspected him to go on IR as to what the report said, but with him projecting to play, I think that's in a way good for Josh Downs. Now hear me out. I think that he's going to distract the defense quite a bit, and I think that's going to be beneficial to Josh Downs. I don't think he sees the additional defensive attention that he would otherwise receive. Now, Tennessee is a poor matchup, obviously. I think he gets a good amount of volume, though, and this projection is with Joe Flacco playing, which I think is going to be more beneficial than Anthony Richardson. And so I do think he's a very safe floor option this week, and if he happens to score a touchdown, he's going to finish much higher than this. Darnell Mooney has been a revelation so far. It's amazing what happens when you go from Chicago to the Rams scheme here in Atlanta. It's a great matchup against Carolina. I think Drake London and Kyle Pitts are more so the beneficiaries this week, but I still think that he's a very high upside option. I just don't think he scores a touchdown this week. Jamison Williams is playing Dallas this week. It's a middle-of-the-road matchup. I think he gets a couple of chunk gains this week and sees a good amount of target volume. I just don't think he scores, but I think that he's a very high upside play, and if I'm wrong and he does, then he's going to have a pretty good game. Rashid Shaheed has been awesome. It's a little bit worrying that we're relying on these long touchdowns for him to be viable in fantasy. Usually that's not a good bet, but he has been awesome so far, and it is a great matchup against Tampa Bay. And so for that reason, I think that he is in general a must start. It's just we do have to worry on a week-to-week basis if he doesn't get that long touchdown. Deontay Johnson is playing Atlanta this week. I do think he sees a good amount of AJ Terrell, and so I don't like that for him quite as much. But I still think that with Andy Dalton at the helm, the upside is just so much better than with Bryce Young. All right, so at 20, I have Dontavian Wicks. I wasn't quite as high on him last week, but I think he has a much better game this week. I think against Arizona, it's going to be a relatively high-scoring game between the two teams. I like Trey McBride and MHJ on the Cardinals a lot this week, and I really like Wicks, Kraft, and Jaden Reed on the Packers this week. And so I do think that while he's not going to have the best game in terms of receptions and yardage, I do think that Wicks scores this week. All right, so we have Devontae Smith back. He's playing Cleveland. It's, in general, a good matchup on paper. I think the Eagles' offense is full go this week. I like basically everybody. The only downside is I think that Dallas Goedert is hurt a little bit by the stars of A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith returning. And so I do think that Devontae Smith is a good volume play this week. I just don't have him scoring. We have Chris Olave playing Tampa Bay. I think that he gets a lot of catches. I think his yardage suffers a little bit, and I don't think he scores because it's really tough to project this game out with Spencer Rattler playing instead of Derek Carr. And so this one admittedly is really hard to project. Until we see what the offense looks like with Rattler, I want to be just a little bit conservative with really everybody on this team. And so Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave are pretty tough to rank this week, but they're both talented. And once we see a little bit of success with Spencer Rattler, I'll be a little bit more comfortable ranking them higher. At 17, we have Tank Dell playing against New England. I do think that Stephon Diggs sees a little bit more of Christian Gonzalez, but I do think both of them see him in coverage. I think that both are very, very high upside plays. I just think that Joe Mixon benefits a little bit more than either one of them do in his return. But I do think that if you have Tank Dell, he is a must start this week. At 16, we have T. Higgins playing against the Giants. He's coming off a wonderful game for us. I don't think he has quite as much success this week. I still think Chase is a much better play, but he's still a very high upside play, and the Bengals' offense is absolutely humming. If you like what you're hearing and seeing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. I try to project out all of the NFL games, at least with the exception of teams on bye or Thursday night games. And as to whether I'm right or wrong, it remains to be seen, but I'd really appreciate it if you like what you're seeing and hearing to like and subscribe. Thanks. Wide receivers that I think are probably low-end wide receiver 1s to high-end wide receiver 2s are BTJ, Terry McLaurin, Chris Godwin, Garrett Wilson, and Mike Evans. BTJ has been awesome so far. Even in matchups like against Jalen Ramsey, He almost had a crazy game. And so I do think that he's a must start in all formats, even against the formidable Chicago Bears passing defense. Until we see him not be successful, and even in tough matchups, it's really hard to not have him reasonably high. And so I do think that he is a must start until he shows that in tough matchups he can't be relied upon. And yeah, he's the wide receiver 11 right now in a full PPR as a rookie. And I think you do have to start him with confidence. Terry McLaurin has a fantastic matchup against the Ravens. I think that they're going to have to pass the ball quite a bit to stay in this game. I do think that Jaden Daniels is the primary beneficiary. I think he has a lot of rushing yards this week. I do think, though, in terms of the passing offense, Terry McLaurin, Zach Ertz, and Austin Eckler are the primary beneficiaries here. And so I do like him this week, and I think he has a ton of upside. Chris Godwin matches up against the Saints this week. I do think that Mike Evans primarily sees the coverage of Marshawn Lattimore, but I do think that both wide receivers are good plays this week, despite Mike Evans generally having trouble with Lattimore throughout his career. And so I think that Chris Godwin is going to have a better day from a volume perspective in terms of receptions and total yardage, but I do think that Evans scores a touchdown. And now we have Garrett Wilson. He's coming off a 23 target game. That is wild. By the way, that is the third most targets ever recorded in an NFL game for a wide receiver. I don't expect that to happen again, but with Nathaniel Hackett being demoted, I think that Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, as well as basically everyone in this Jets offense, is going to perform much better on a weekly basis. And I think that obviously you're starting Garrett Wilson. It's hard to imagine a team that you could have where you're generally benching him. But I don't think he has quite the week he did this past week. But still, nonetheless, I think that we see a lot more upside in general from Garrett Wilson. Mike Evans, as I mentioned a minute ago, is probably going to see a little bit more of Lattimore than Chris Godwin is. And so while I don't think that's great for him in terms of total receptions and yardage, I do think he scores a touchdown. Now we have wide receivers that I think are firmly wide receiver ones. I just think they're the low-end wide receiver one variety as opposed to real threats to be the wide receiver one overall this week. We have Marvin Harrison, Zay Flowers, and Jaden Reed. I do think that MHJ scores this week. He's been wonderful in terms of touchdown production. However, he's had a couple games this year where the total output wasn't that great. I do think that changes this week, and I think he's an absolute must-start and has a pretty solid game with a touchdown. Zay Flowers has been very hit or miss. I think this is a hit game. He is playing Washington. They are turnstiles in terms of their cornerbacks allowing wide receiver production. I do think that Lamar Jackson and Jaden Daniels have a little bit of a QB duel this week. And so I really like Terry McLaurin and Zay Flowers to get a good amount of volume. Jaden Reed, I was a little bit too high on last week. I think that he's still a great play. I do think he scores a touchdown. I think I was just a little bit too optimistic about his total yardage output, but he's a threat in the run game and the receiving game, and I do think he scores this week. Wide receivers that I think are firmly wide receiver ones with the ultimate potential to be the wide receiver one overall this week are DJ Moore, Drake London, Stephon Diggs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, AJ Brown, CeeDee Lamb, and Jamar Chase. DJ Moore was wonderful last week. He and Caleb Williams are appearing to form a special connection. They were a lot more successful on deep shots last week. And so I do think against Jacksonville, it's obviously an advantageous matchup, and I think he's a must start. And I think he has a very, very solid game for us. Drake London is coming off one of the best, if not the best game of his NFL career. He plays the Panthers this week. It's as inviting of a matchup as you could really draw up. And so I think he's a great volume play this week, and I do think he scores a touchdown. Stephon Diggs is playing New England. I do think he sees a little bit more of coverage from Christian Gonzalez than Tank Dell does. But wide receivers that are connected to CJ Stroud in general do really well. And so I do think that he's a must start. I think he gets a good amount of volume. I'd expect no less than 10 targets. And so I think he's a must start with a good amount of upside. And I do think he scores this week. Amon-Ra St. Brown is playing Dallas this week. I think he gets a lot of volume in terms of receptions and yardage. I don't have him scoring, but against Dallas, they're going to be passing quite a bit. I do think the offense in general is going to be successful. I just think that Sam Laporta and Jahmyr Gibbs are the touchdown beneficiaries this week. But yeah, you're starting ASRB, and he has every week wide receiver one overall potential. AJ Brown is finally making his return for us in fantasy. We've been waiting for a couple weeks now. It's really exciting to get him back. I think he has a fantastic game, as does really everyone except Dallas Goedert in the Eagles offense this week. And so I think he's a plug and play must start wide receiver one with the absolute threat of being the wide receiver one overall. CeeDee Lamb is playing Detroit. While Detroit's pass rush, really Aiden Hutchinson, is absolutely ferocious, their coverage isn't. And so I think he's a fantastic volume play, and I do think he scores this week. And finally, we have Jamar Chase. In 2 out of the last 3 weeks, he's been an incredibly high scoring wide receiver one. I still think that continues. New York does not have anybody that can really match up with him. Barely anybody can. And so I think that he is probably my best bet to be the wide receiver one overall. And I think that unless he has a tough matchup and we see a little bit less production from him, as long as he's on this hot streak, I think that he is probably the best bet each and every single week to be the wide receiver one overall. Wide receivers that I think are probably low-end wide receiver threes this week are Keon Coleman, Keenan Allen, Jalen Tolbert, and Jakobi Meyers. Wide receivers I think are probably mid to high-end wide receiver threes in general are Michael Pittman, Christian Kirk, Amari Cooper, Wan'Dale Robinson, George Pickens, Xavier Legette, and Rome Odunze. Wide receivers that I think are probably mid to low-end wide receiver twos in general are Josh Downs, Darnell Mooney, Jamison Williams, Rashid Shaheed, Deontay Johnson, Dontavian Wicks, Devontae Smith, Chris Olave, Tank Dell, and T. Higgins. Wide receivers that I think are probably high-end wide receiver twos to potentially low-end wide receiver ones are BTJ, Terry McLaurin, Chris Godwin, Garrett Wilson, and Mike Evans. Wide receivers that I think are probably low-end wide receiver ones that probably won't be the wide receiver one overall this week are MHJ, Flowers, and Jaden Reed. And then wide receivers that I think are absolute threats to be the wide receiver one overall, and I think are firmly entrenched as wide receiver ones in general, are DJ Moore, Drake London, Stephon Diggs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, AJ Brown, CeeDee Lamb, and Jamar Chase. All right, so you know the drill. Who am I too high on? Who am I too low on? Is there somebody that I'm just missing from this list entirely that should be on here? Let me know below in the comment section, and let me know why. With that being said, if you like what you've seen and heard so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel. Thanks.